Hello and welcome to the Tea with Jamie podcast. It is Tuesday, August the 18th. We are again in race week, heading into the Zandvoort Grand Prix in the Netherlands. It is a sprint weekend, and today we're going to do a news review. It's been a while since we've done that. All the teams are back in action and everyone's back off their breaks, so the news is starting to filter out. So let's go through a few things that I thought were interesting subjects to talk about. All right, first of all, I think one of the big stories for this weekend is going to be Aston Martin, and in particular Honda. Now, the Zandvoort track is a bit of a windy track. It's very similar to Hungary in many respects. There's not a great emphasis on power. However, a stronger power unit is definitely going to benefit the Aston Martin for sure, considering its deficits in places like Spa that we've seen this year, as highlighted there, should I say. So it's definitely not going to hurt. So I think we're going to see, was that just a fluke in Hungary, that performance gain? I think if it works there, it's also probably going to work here in Zandvoort. I think the real test is going to come in places like Monza and Azerbaijan and places like that, but we'll get there. So anyway, that is the big story, I think, really from a technical standpoint. Is this Aston Martin going to make a further step from the leap, the bound it made in Hungary? So this is an article on Racing News 365 called Honda Set for Important Milestone Upon F1's Dutch GP Return. This is by Jake Nicol. And let's hear what Trackside General Manager Shintaro Orihara has to say about this weekend's upgrade. He says, "The Dutch Grand Prix is an important milestone for Honda, as this is where we introduce our new spec power unit. This is the result of an intense period of hard work at HRC Sakura, together with HRC UK and Aston Martin. Zandvoort is a sprint weekend, which means we only have a single free practice session. This will bring an additional challenge to complete the evaluation of our new package in that limited running, but it's a test we're looking forward to. In Hungary, we saw a step forward with the new chassis. With the new specification power unit now introduced, we look forward to building on that progress together with the team over the remainder of the season." So not telling us anything that we don't already know, really. But the fact that it's a sprint weekend is definitely notable. Not having 3 solid hours of bedding that new power unit in, testing it, making sure everything's working as it should is definitely an issue. But that does speak to them. Now they have taken all that pain in the first half of the season, actually going, right, well, I guess we could introduce it at a regular weekend, the weekend after, or we could just bring it in at the first opportunity, which is Zandvoort. So they have obviously chosen to do the latter. And it's going to be really interesting. This is a big story to keep an eye on. So how are they going to be compared to, obviously their direct comparison is Cadillac, which they've leapt above, or they did in Hungary anyway, and Cadillac had made ground on them. They started behind them in the beginning of the season, just on pure pace. Aston Martin overtook them towards the latter half of the first half of the season, second quarter, I guess you would call it. And now, where's that going to be? It looked like Aston Martin had made a step on Williams and was threatening Haas. So, if this further development continues with no development basically in the first half of the season, are they just going to get better and better week on week, race on race? That is going to be the real interesting thing. And the fact that they were so competitive with this major upgrade suggests that they've got their wind tunnel up and running, working really well and correlating, right? That's the big thing. And that was the thing, if you remember, that Adrian Newey was criticizing, was saying that the facilities weren't up to scratch, they weren't correlating, and that was a big problem. So he seems to have facilitated the facilities to get them up to scratch. And if that is the case, if Honda are also on that same track of moving in the right direction, this could be a meteoric rise. I mean, could we be seeing Q3 regular appearances, regular points. I mean, I think podium's out of the question for this season, but when we saw that leap from McLaren a few years ago, almost from the back to the front, not quite, but almost, anything's possible. Now, they're not going to get to the front. I mean, I think it's fair to say, stranger things have happened, but I think it's fair to say they're not going to be winning races this season. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves after just one race in Hungary. But the next couple of rounds are going to really be interesting to see. Is all this positive talk about we're delaying, we're waiting for the big upgrade, is this going to be a McLaren 24? Or is it going to be a Williams 26 situation? So, yeah. Actually, no, it was McLaren 23, right, when they had the big turnaround? I don't know. My memory's a sieve. So anyway, that's a big story to look out for. This is an interesting one. This is an article also on Racing News 365. Really wanted to talk about this, by Samuel Coop. This article is called Mercedes Explain How It Became Out of Sync with F1 Rivals Amid Extraordinary Development War. Now, this is really golden, this. I love these quotes. This is really telling of the situation. This is with Mercedes Technical Director James Allison, and this was on their podcast, the Silver Arrows podcast, I think it was called. So they're quoting the podcast, and I'm quoting the article quoting the podcast. So it's a little convoluted. Anyway, let's get to James Allison. He said, quote, "One of the defining characteristics of this regulation cycle is just how immature the regulations still are. Development rates are enormous compared to previous years. On the aerodynamic side, the gain rate we're seeing in the wind tunnel is roughly 6 or 7 times greater than it was last season. It's roughly half a second every couple of months, which is a very significant rate of progress. We made a conscious decision before the season to push the first car harder than we've ever pushed one before. We left things later than usual and effectively built a program with almost no contingency. The upside was that we were able to capture as much of that steep development curve as possible before the first race, which is why the car arrived with such a strong level of performance. The downside is that we essentially spent all of that performance up front. Other teams finalized their cars earlier and were therefore able to begin developing upgrades earlier." End quote. So let's just clarify exactly what he means there. So essentially, they were developing the car and pushing what the first car was going to look like right up until the last minute, which gave them no contingency whatsoever if something were to go wrong or something that they developed didn't work. They couldn't go to like a previous iteration, or they couldn't have they weren't necessarily, they didn't give themselves any headroom to be like, we're not pushing it to such a degree that it could fail spectacularly and then we'd be, out of luck. This is all very esoteric, the way I'm describing this, of course, because he doesn't go into any specifics, but that was the philosophy, right? Push it to the very last minute and then manufacture it, put it on the car just before we're shipping it out to Barcelona or Bahrain, whichever one he's referring to. And then eventually, of course, Australia. And presumably they were doing this right up until Australia too. So they came out the blocks with a car that was essentially the most cutting-edge version of that car they could have. So therefore, they had nothing else in the pipeline. Everything was on the car. So they scored all their points, and they were so much better than everyone because they had absolutely no contingency. They threw everything at it. Everyone else, however, started with a little more of a solid but less risky baseline, which gave them something to build upon. And that is exactly what's happened. The other teams have started to converge with Mercedes, and Mercedes don't seem to have progressed at the same rate as other teams. This also could explain their hugely unreliable season to this point, that they pushed things to such a degree that there was no tolerance. I'm drawing conclusions here because he's being very vague in the quote, so I'm going to have to make logical leaps here. and the battery being possibly a big element of that. So now they've almost also been doing an Aston Martin, i.e. they've been sort of saving up their upgrades because they didn't really have anywhere to go. They didn't really have a direction until they were into the season and they were developing as they were going. All the other teams were as well, of course, but they had a head start because they'd stopped the development earlier in the process of the first car in order to optimize that first car and have a bit of a runway, you know. I feel like I'm over-explaining this, but you know, I think it's an interesting point, right? Alison goes on, quote, "We're now slightly out of phase with some of our competitors. They have been introducing upgrades while we've been rebuilding our development pipeline. What we're seeing is that everyone is making gains at a broadly similar rate. That means the competitive picture can change very quickly. Our objective is simply to keep our nose in front and ensure that the next wave of upgrades restores the advantage we built at the start of the season. In the meantime, we just have to ride out those moments when other teams arrive with significant new developments." End quote. So they made this big step early on, and they aren't bolting on components of the car and seeing these huge leaps forward. They're just developing what they have, and it's a little more iterative than the other teams who are figuring things out, slapping something on, seeing big advantages, and are just eating away at Mercedes. So I think the obvious example here is McLaren, right? They started out quite poor. I mean, they barely even started the races at the start of the season. They seem to have moved on with leaps and bounds. Now, there was an article in this break here that, can't remember who said it, but it was an interesting point. They've, historically been known to have a sort of shorter wheelbase the last few years, and this year is no exception. And they now regret that decision. They think that has harmed them. Also, they had to make somewhat educated guesses on their gear ratios because they didn't have the full championship power unit at their disposal to work with up until the very last minute. And they've sort of gone in a wrong direction with their gear ratios. So that aside, they have been absolutely developing that car hand over fist alongside Ferrari. Now, of course, McLaren are interesting in comparison because it's just the gearbox and the rest of the car that is different. Otherwise, they have the same power unit as the Mercedes. So if McLaren get the finger out and really get their car up to scratch, they are the most direct comparison to Mercedes because they are legally required to supply McLaren with exactly the same power unit. Any upgrade in the software or the hardware, they have to also give to McLaren. And of course, also Alpine. And of course, also Williams. And, so Ferrari are the outliers a little bit here because they are also, of course, the most direct competitor to Mercedes. And they have been just plodding away, bringing upgrades, and they've already brought one power unit upgrade and they've got another one. Now, also Mercedes have one to bring. I believe they haven't done that yet. So Ferrari are the unknown element here. They could just steal a march, right? They could just come out of nowhere and just, James Allison talks about keeping their nose ahead. Ferrari could just as well do that. They could show up with an upgrade and all of a sudden tables are turned. Everything is just slightly more in favor of the Ferrari. And then it's a battle between Lewis and Charles, with everyone else behind. So could this be like a Brawn 2009 situation where they come out the gates? And remember, this is the team that were Brawn, right? Back in the day, going way back. Could they have won the championship with this first half of the season and they're just trying to salvage the second half? Is that what's going to happen? Would be very interesting, right? Anyway, interesting quotes there from James Allison and the strategy by Mercedes, which absolutely tracks with what we know of what has gone on so far this season and what we can see in the results. Their dominance has dwindled. I'm not going to read from this, but I thought this was a really interesting article that I think you should check out. If you are a member of Formula1.com and you have a membership, I have the Apple TV anyway, so I can log into this. There's a great article. Unfortunately, it's on the unlocked section, so you do have to be, part of F1.com or F1 TV or whatever it's called. It's an article by Philip Horton. How do psychologists help Formula One drivers be at their best? This is purely a recommendation, like I say, because it's unlocked. I don't want to quote it and, take it from behind a paywall. But this is a really, really interesting read. So I would recommend you take a look at that. Cover a lot of subjects. How, of course, drivers prepare to operate at the highest possible level. How they cope with disappointment and pressure, and how you can actually apply some of these psychological tricks in your everyday life. So yeah, definitely check that out. Really great article. All right, so speaking about McLaren and their development, let's go to Planet F1 and an article, McLaren reveals its budget cap strategy as rivals question development spending. So a lot of rivals have been looking at both Ferrari and McLaren and have been saying, how can they bring all these upgrades within the budget cap? And good question. I mean, how long are they going to keep doing it for? So let's get to some quotes from Andrea Stella. Quote him a lot in this pod. Actually, before I get there, let's get to Toto Wolff. We're always a little bit surprised that Ferrari can throw these huge updates at the car in the way they do. In my opinion, they need to be running out of money soon, cost cap money, because we can't do that. Simply lacking the buffer and cost cap to be able to bring so many parts in the way they do. So hopefully that's going to change towards the end of the season when they won't be able to bring any parts anymore. At least let's say the logic would say that, and then we're going to come with more. End quote. So he's of course referring to Ferrari, but I think you can also apply the same to McLaren. So now let's get to Andrea Stella. He said, quote, "The upgrades we took in Hungary, they are part of a round of upgrades that is distributed over a few rounds. So this was the first part of these upgrades. There will be a few things coming for the next races. Definitely in our approach to the budget cap, we knew that 2026 would have been not much about the starting point, but more about the race to upgrade the car. So we wanted to leave enough overhead in our budget prediction such that we were in a condition to spend money on upgrading the car. So independently of the extra allowance that is permitted by the power unit regulation changes for 2027, we were already in a good position in terms of being able to invest in upgrading the MCL40. The allowance you have for next year, it can be used, but obviously you need to be careful that you don't need this money for the modifications that will have to be applied to the car. But in itself, if you want to focus on this season, definitely something that you can bring forward and take advantage of. But I think for some teams at some stage, it will also be a matter of which season are you focusing on. Because it's not only the budget that is the limitation, you have limitations from a design point of view, or which car do you want to put in the wind tunnel, next year's car or this year's car. So there's several questions that you have to answer, and part of this answer depends on where you are shifting your focus this season or entirely onto next year." End quote. All right, tons there, right? So they took a different approach to Mercedes. They were like, all right, we're going to show up to the season and make sure we're fully funded for a season of upgrades, because we don't want to put all our eggs in this sort of launch car basket and then be sort of stuck for upgrading it and pivoting as we need to. They were much more pragmatic. And again, that's sort of showing out, same with Ferrari, it's sort of bearing out in the results. Mercedes, I think, are confused because I think they spent so much money on creating this launch car that they have had to mete out these upgrades much more carefully, whereas McLaren have got the ability to spend the money, and the same with Ferrari. Also, he makes a good point. All the teams are limited in their wind tunnel time for the season, right? Based on their position in the constructors table last year. So they have to decide, are we going to use this wind tunnel time to develop this year's car? Or are we going to do what Red Bull have done and essentially are not really going to develop this Red Bull that much according to them? I saw some reports, and are focusing entirely on next year. Now, Red Bull, that seems like an obvious choice, right? They're not really in a position to fight for any championship this year. Maybe the occasional win, looked like in Austria, Max could have potentially won that race, given it was, just a couple of laps longer. That was really the only restriction for him winning. Mercedes were weird, Ferrari were weird in Austria, so Was it that Red Bull were particularly good, or was it that those other teams were particularly bizarre, particularly Ferrari in Austria, but we won't go there. So yeah, it's really strategic. Are we thinking long term here? Like, if you do these incremental upgrades for this car, is that going to hurt you for having more of a bigger picture, given the fact that this is the very start of the regulations? Do you want to make broader, bigger changes, more consequential, philosophical changes almost, for this year, next year, and the year after? Or do you want to try and wring every last penny out of these regulations this year because you think you've got a chance? Is it too early to make that call? I don't think it is for Red Bull. I think they're kind of out of it. But I think Ferrari and McLaren, that's a tougher call. Particularly Ferrari. I mean, Lewis is, right there. He could win the championship. It's not unheard of. Would it actually be beneficial to McLaren to sacrifice this year, finish a little bit down in the constructors' positions, lose some money, yes, but gain some wind tunnel time for the future? Interesting direction they could go in. And I feel like both, Mercedes have to go for it. Like, there's no question for them. They're leading. They've got to cling on. They've got to bring the upgrades. They've got to do what they need to do. Yes, they stole a march on everyone at the beginning, but they've still got to, try and win this thing. Ferrari, I think, still have to put the pedal to the metal. If they're not going to, there is no guarantee with Ferrari that they're going to have a winning package in any year, right? I think they have to go for it, because they are the closest rival to the Mercedes. The Mercedes does look delicate, does look like it could break. So I think they've got to go for it. With both of them, with just Lewis, I don't know how they do it, but McLaren, then you're starting to get into the grey area a little bit. So yeah, interesting quotes from both of those two, Toto and Andrea. And then finally, an article here on the race about Alpine. Can this upgrade save an F1 season in decline? Now, the Alpine is an interesting story, right? Started quite strong. They've gone to the Mercedes power unit for this year. So you would expect them to be doing well, which they were doing pretty well. I mean, Williams haven't exactly, but they're massively overweight, so that's a different subject. But they started strongly. They looked probably strongest of the rest, right? Then Racing Bulls in recent times, since pretty much Monaco, right? Maybe even Canada, they have looked the stronger team. And then is Audi also looking strong compared to them? And then all of a sudden they're down with the Hasses and maybe in the Williams, if this decline continues. And they got a really well-funded team with the best power unit on the grid, two great drivers. What's going on? So anyway, this article, again, I'm not going to quote it word for word. I would just check it out. There's some interesting quotes from Gasly here. Let's just go to a quote. He said, quote, "It's not the reality I want to see, but there's no hiding from it, and there's been a couple of races where it's kind of the same story. In qualifying 12th, 13th, behind Racing Bulls and Audi in the race, it's like somehow you think that maybe we're going to be there, and then I can see them, but it's just pure race pace. We're not there." So then they ask him a bit more as to what's going on and why this is the case. He said, quote, "I think it's just development. They've, brackets Racing Bulls, really brought a lot of upgrades. It seems to work well. And from what we hear, even slightly better than they would have anticipated. At the moment, it's credit to them for the work they're doing. It's up to us to deliver with the new parts that will come in the next races." End quote. So I don't really know what the Alpine upgrade philosophy is. They seem to be strong at the start, so maybe they did develop a little later, a bit more like the Mercedes, and have drifted away a bit like the Mercedes, and haven't necessarily had the capacity or budget to bring the upgrades in the same way that the other teams have. So we're sort of seeing an equalizing of the various strategies here at this midpoint in the season, where the teams that have got the headroom for upgrades, have got the budget allocated, are starting to see their advantage come up, and the teams that sort of took their chance early on are starting to be affected by that negatively now. So, this is sort of the story of the episode, I guess. That wasn't planned. Gasly goes on, quote, "It's the standard of Formula One. I think if you bring upgrades, you expect it to definitely get better, and on my side, I'm not doubting that it's going to do what the team expect. Because Aston Martin improved by 2 seconds this weekend, they have another engine coming. Racing Bulls improved by a second since the start of the year, Audi as well, and we just didn't do much steps. So yeah, I think it's critical for us if we want to keep the hope for that 5th place in the championship." End quote. So he's saying basically that they have sort of stood still while the teams around them have made huge progress. And every time they bring an upgrade, it just improves the car. And he's saying that for them, he's saying that for the other teams. There are very few examples this year where teams have brought an upgrade and it just hasn't worked. That's the state of the development war this year, that it's so competitive and the learning is so high, given everything that has changed, it's almost a guaranteed improvement. And so if you don't improve, you're effectively going backwards. Okay, so that was a bit of a theme. Didn't even realise when I put these articles together. I themed the episode. Anyway, that was a news one. I hope that was interesting. I will be back again tomorrow, possibly with a little Zandvoort preview episode. I tend to do that midweek. Maybe I'll do that on Thursday. We'll see. But yeah, have a great day and I will see you then. Okay, bye-bye for now. I've been your host, Jamie Muffett. You can find me on social media for more of this rambling nonsense under my name or F1_Jamie. This is an RPS audio production.